Hey everyone, how's it going? This is Andrew Syrios, Stewardship Properties, here with BiggerPockets to talk about due diligence. Good old due diligence. We're going to make sure that you don't buy a house that will turn into a giant money pit, like the Tom Hanks movie, and just ruin you from, just bankrupt you into oblivion. Because I've seen a lot of people really. I've experienced being one of the people that have really been turned upside down by bad acquisitions, which can almost always be avoided, or at least for the most part, with proper due diligence. This goes for both houses, apartments, for larger office buildings, for pretty much anything you can find in that respect. Kevin, hello, welcome aboard. We'll wait a little bit longer here till we get a couple people in. But yeah, we're going to go over, I'll spend the first part of it talking about due diligence for houses, then we'll go on a little bit more for due diligence for apartments, and may even spend a bit of time on due diligence for portfolios, which we've done. We've purchased a couple portfolios, and I'll share a couple articles with you after the fact that you can get if you want to get any more information on this topic. Let's see here. So, Tony, welcome aboard from Boston. Good deal. Good to see you. Stephen, how's it going? Robert, good to have you on board. Anyways, so let me get started with the basics. With due diligence, just a quick definition. Due diligence predominantly refers to the work you do once you have a property under contract and are trying to make sure that it meets your expectations, both with regards to the condition that it's in, the repairs that it will require, as well as things like if it has tenants, if it's an apartment complex, or even if it's a house, then make sure that they're, like, if you think they're paying, if you're under the impression that they're actually paying their rent, that's important to know. Get an idea of what are the fixed expenses if it's an apartment complex or things like that. This is your period of time where you are verifying your assumptions. Trust but verify, or in real estate, don't really trust that much at all, and then verify. That'd probably be the better way to go. A nice saying I've heard is, buyers are liars, and sellers are liars too. Adam, Jonathan, Erica, Stephen, welcome aboard. Lika, I'm sorry if I'm butchering your name. I do have the habit of doing that. How's it going? Nicole, Jason, let's see if I hope I'm not missing. Christine, good to have you on board. Regina, good to have you on board as well. Okay, so I'll just get started here on the brief rundown with regards to houses. We're going to start with houses, and the first part to know is with regards to beforehand. Before you've even made the offer, there's a bit of due diligence. You're not just making wild, blind offers, well, at least for the moment, you probably shouldn't be, without having at least some idea of what you're doing. So you do have to, and a couple of things, you are not going to retrade based on like the value of the area. Like if you think, or retrade is when you renegotiate the price after you've already got it under contract. And maybe if you wildly got it wrong, you might have to back out of the contract. You thought this area is worth, $100,000 for a house like this. Actually, it's worth, 60. Okay, maybe you have to back out. But that's not a legitimate reason to retrade. What you're looking at is something that doesn't meet your expectations. And one of the things, which kind of means you have to have some expectations going in. And generally, I want to make it clear, especially in the case of a house, of a property that needs some work, or an apartment, what my expectations are. So I actually include in my, like on an apartment complex, I include in my letter of intent, which is sort of a pre-offer, where apartments often have longer, very detailed contracts that lawyers write up. These are for bigger apartments. So you have like a letter of intent that kind of lays out, we agree to this in principle, now we'll write out all the specifics. I usually write out what my assumptions of the property are. If it's a house, and I might do it in an email, I try to get it in writing, but at least like this is what I'm coming into it with. So if it doesn't meet those expectations, I can easily point to that and say, okay, well, here you go. This doesn't meet your doesn't meet what I said and you agreed. I mean, so this is why I believe we should retrade the price. And if they're not willing to do that, just back out of the deal. Or if it's too far for me to go, too far bridge. There's certain properties that I'm not interested in. An $80,000 rehab on this house. I'm going to leave. But usually, for the most part, you'll meet your expectations. Okay, so the first thing is when you're doing your walkthrough inspections, especially I'm looking at a lot of houses, so I can't do a very detailed scope of work. Our scopes of work are usually like 300 items. They include every little thing on them. So what I do is I break it down. I actually base it off of Jay Scott's book, the book on estimating rehab expenses, which I highly recommend. people purchase or take a look at. He has 25 different items, and they go from, and I actually added one, but they be things like, you know, the roof, the exterior paint, the interior paint, the flooring, and I just go brief estimates of what it's going to cost. Okay, I think it's going to cost about $2,500 to repaint this house, or, you know, this house needs new vinyl in the kitchen, but it doesn't need new carpet. The carpet's okay, we can just clean that. And the kitchen, that's about $500. And you will need to work on getting basic ideas of these costs, and one of the best ways to do that is one of the best ways to start looking at talking to people, talking to contractors, talking to other investors, reading books like Jay Scott or like the BiggerPockets, but also looking at contractor bids. When you do get contractor bids, take a look at them, get an idea of, I mean, they'll differ for sure, but you should start to get an idea of what things cost. There are websites you can go to, I think like Home Advisor, or I think that's the name of the site, where you can get cost estimates, but they're usually pretty broad. There's location specific, they vary on the location. If you're in a more expensive market, it will cost more, particularly because the labor will cost more. But you want to get a broad idea, and you can bring along, you know, a contractor. You don't want to abuse this, but you can ask them to come take a look at a house with you, especially if you have it on a contract, and give you an idea of what they think it will cost. You don't want to abuse that. Contractors get very sick of that very quickly, but once or twice, a couple times, you know, that they'll certainly be willing to help you in doing that. So that's the first thing, is when you go through a property, have a list of, you know, I have this 1-page sheet with 26 items, and I go through it and I make, you know, I think it's got this expense, it's got this expense, and I add it all up, and then I add a holding cost, because it's gonna be off the market for a while. You've got, you know, even if you're flipping, it's gonna have holding costs. If you're you know, you're gonna rent it, you know, you've got $20,000 of work. You've also got a couple $1,000s of just holding it. You know, if you're paying, especially if you're paying interest on a loan. But you also got utilities, insurance, etc. And then also I added a contingency, because I generally can't see everything. So I put in a 20% contingency, especially when you start opening up walls or anything like that. You often find stuff that you weren't expecting. And I rarely, if ever, see projects come in under budget. I've rarely heard people complain, oh, I'm always coming in under budget, or even saying that. It's almost always you go over budget on your rehab. So I would put in a contingency for things you don't miss, or under budget in the first place. So a couple of things. Bren says, are you able to share that sheet? Yeah, I can. If you want to, just send me a message on BiggerPockets, and for you to be able to share documents, you have to become colleagues, or you have to. So send me a message with that, and I will just shoot it over to you if you'd like it. I probably won't. I'll probably be brief. I wrote an article about this a while back and got inundated with requests, and that's fine. But I'll probably just say yes and shoot it back to you and whatnot. But yeah, I'd be happy to share it. Just send me a message. Just make a colleague request on BiggerPockets, and I will email it over to you. It's just an Excel document that prints out on one page. Timothy notes the J. Scott book is excellent. Yes, I absolutely agree. Thomas, 20% of the estimated expenses for a contingency. Yeah, this is on my preliminary walkthrough before we have a property under contract, and I don't do 20% of the holding costs. I mean, you could do that. I just generally do 20% of the expenses, or of what I think the rehab will cost. When I add up everything, you know, it's like, okay, it needs a new roof, that's $5,000. It needs new carpet, that's $2,000. It needs paint job, that's $2,500. So let's say that's it. Let's say that plus a countertop. So that's $500. So we get $10,000. Plus, I usually throw in like a knickknacks line item. Like, you know, you got light bulb, like a light fixture here. You got light bulbs. You got outlet covers. You got, you know, door stops. You've got you know, a little bit of trim here. Just little things like that. Depending on the size of the house and how roughed up and shaped it might be $1,000, $1,500, $2,000. But throw that in there too. So we're at $11,000. And then I take 20% of 11,000. Let's say that's everything, and then that's $2,200. So then you're at $13,200. And then I think, you know, it's going to take a couple of months. You know, it's going to take probably not going to be able to start for about a month because my crews are backed up. 2 months to do the rehab, and then another month to lease it. So we're probably looking at 4 months of holding costs. I'll make it 5 just to be safe. You know, we're paying $400 a month on our loan because it's less expensive property. Plus, I got $100 of holding costs, but $2,500 in holding costs, maybe $3,000 in holding costs. And so you add that all together, you got $13,200 plus your $3,000 in holding costs, and you get $16,200. Now I add one other thing in there, and I'll just get to it now. This will just be a quick. We'll move ahead of the line in this, and that is with regards to I always, unless it's a very new property, I always snake the sewer line, and or I camera the sewer line. I'm sorry. Usually you can usually find somebody to do this for $150 to $200 or something like that. And what they do is they bring a camera down the sewer line, and you're looking for breaks, you're looking for major offsets, you're looking for roots just coming up through it. Now you got to be a little careful. If you're dealing with a plumber, and most of these guys are plumbers, they're gonna be like, "Oh yeah, you need to replace it." But if you just have a little offset here, a couple of roots there, you can probably just snake it out and get away with it. But if it has major problems with it, like it's huge offset, roots everywhere, you can see breaks all, you need to replace that sewer line. And a sewer line replacement costs between $3,500 and $6,000. More if you got like really, really dense city street, and you got to cut, or you got to cut through the street, but you got to know that beforehand. So I usually put, in the areas that we buy a lot, there are a ton of bad sewer lines. So I usually put like $1,000 contingency for that, even though it's an all or nothing sort of thing, unless you're snaking it, which would maybe cost $150. But I kind of throw that contingency in there too. Just kind of figure the way this is probably not the best way for people who are looking to buy one or two or something like that. But if we're buying in kind of volume, and so I'm just assuming this is gonna make gonna work out over time. So I mean that's the brief rundown. I'm not spending a ton of time with these properties. For new investors, I'd recommend spending more. I mean, when you're still learning things, spending more time there. Making sure you're not missing things, trying to be more precise in your calculations. I mean, if you're buying a lot of properties, you can kind of make little mistakes here and there, and they smooth over. If you're buying just one, and that's really the focus, those little mistakes can be more of a problem, because they get smoothed over the long run. But if you're just buying one, there's nothing to smooth it over. so I would spend more time there, be more careful. But at the same time, it is not worth putting together, a full scope of work with 200, 300 line items for every little thing on a house you haven't even gotten under contract. So you got to remember your time is worth something, and a property under contract is not worth that much to you. So that's very important to know. I'll go through the other questions here. What would be a major offset? Oh, I'd say the exact, I mean, for one thing, an offset is much worse if it's on the bottom of the pipe than the top. So if you got, let's say the sewage is flowing, we're talking about sewage here on BiggerPockets, right before you start your weekend with a nice conversation about raw sewage. So you got sewage going down the pipe. If the offset, so you got the pipe here, and this is where it meets. If the offset is like this, and so it's going down this way, that's not as bad as if it's like this, where the sewage is literally hitting up against the part that's offset. That right there is a bigger problem, and you can't have it be as offset. If it's an inch or two, that's not bad. If it's a couple of inches, you're starting to have a problem. You can do spot fixes on sewer lines. The problem with spot fixes is generally like the ones that you have a lot of problems with are these clay pipes. I don't know why they'd ever use that, but nowadays they use I think they use ABS. I think they use ABS, and it's much better, and rarely do roots get into it. But if you're only fixing one spot, still the rest of it is clay and likely to break sometime in the future. And it usually still, the big part is the digging. Really, I mean, even when they're bursting pipes, the newer technology where they actually send a new pipe through the old pipe, very interesting. But even doing that, there's still a lot of digging, because you got to get down there, and you got to make the hole like this, because if you do it too narrow, it's very dangerous. And so you're still going to be paying 50% of the cost just to do a spot fix or something like that. I mean, it varies depending on the depth, but that is I would generally recommend just replacing the whole line. There are exceptions for sure, especially if the whole line includes a lot that's under concrete, and you don't have the ability to burst it or something like that, or you don't have a plumber on that who can't. Then yeah, spot fix might make sense, but generally speaking, I would lean towards replacing it. Kevin, what's the oldest you'd leave a hot water heater in a home if it's working? Well, I would say if it's working, I usually run these things into the ground unless it's like, I mean, if it's rusted on the top or if it's leaking, I'd probably get rid of it. But usually I run them into the ground. I mean, if it's if you're getting 20 plus years, it's you're probably on its last legs and maybe it's worth replacing. But generally, my philosophy with this stuff is, and there are exceptions, but generally it's just run them into the ground and then replace them. Then why wait? Unless it's extremely inefficient with hot water heaters, I haven't had that problem much. Usually they'll just go out. They just go out and then you got to replace them. So Robert, what's my opinion on single family houses versus multifamily? I see a lot of experts leaning towards multi instead of single family. We do more single family actually. It's just worked better with our financing model, which is using a lot of private lenders who generally are looking for investments of that range. I would say multifamily is great. We have done plenty of that. And if you're looking to get into large properties like syndication type things, it certainly makes sense. You certainly get a lot of units in one place. You can buy a lot, 20 units with a multifamily much faster than a house. The houses also are a lot more liquid and a lot easier to start with. So, and the due diligence looking for both is relatively similar, although the main thing is there's just some additional things to do with apartments, additional things to be careful with. Once you have a property under contract, I like to think you've got to think of it as the Goldilocks zone. You don't want to do too little, but you also really don't want to do too much, especially if you're buying in volume. There is a point when it gets over the top. I would recommend for any new investor to always get an inspection on a property before purchasing it. If you're a seasoned investor and you know what you're looking for, and you've done a lot of these, it might not be necessary. It's still probably worth doing on properties that have a problem. You should always walk through the property again. I recommend, unless it's in pristine shape. But I would generally always double check to make sure that what you saw the first time, you didn't miss something. With the inspection, inspection reports are a great way to ask for a reduction in price. If it comes to that, like if you have a licensed inspector saying, you got X, Y, or Z problem, they got this inspection report. It's very common, especially in residential housing, to get these requests back. It's almost part of the game. It's like you get these requests with like, here's the inspection report, and here's like 19 items we want you to fix, or 19 items that we want you to offer a discount for. And so, yeah, I mean, the inspection report is a great thing to offer. Now, you're probably not going to get a huge discount on top of that, unless you find something that's really, really wrong. But I definitely recommend any new investor to get an inspection. Some of the key items to look for, just if you have a pen and pad, I also have an article that goes over all of these, and I will post that at the end of this discussion. But some of the major key things to look for when you're walking through a property. This is both before you have it under contract, and again once you have it under contract. You want to look for old HVAC. Now, even if the HVAC, well, actually, first and foremost, you want to get the utilities on. Now, this might not be possible if you're buying from like Freddie Mae or Fannie Mac. I mean, they're not, and it's a vacant, busted up property. It might be really challenging to get all the utilities on. So it might not be possible if it's really just to get them on, especially if they're missing things. If they had all the plumbing stripped, you're not really going to be able to get the water on. If you have had all the electrical stripped, you're not going to be able to get the electrical on. But then again, you kind of know what you're looking at. You're looking at a major repipe, a major rewire, or something like that. It can be a lot more difficult to do some of these things if you're dealing with some banks, not all banks, but some banks, particularly Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, HUD, or distressed sellers in certain situations. You also got to look at it. Fannie Mae is not going to retrade with you. I mean, you are simply looking at whether or not you're going to purchase or back out. Most banks aren't going to offer any sort of discount. Many distressed sellers can't offer a discount. If you're buying a property or if you're doing a short sale, I mean, they don't have any choice. It's just what the bank will take. If you're buying from somebody who's literally selling it to you for what they owe in their fees, they can't take a discount. So you got to know that going in. It's really whether or not you're going to buy or not. If you're dealing with a regular seller, perhaps a motivated out-of-state, a landlord, just tired landlord, something like that, then you have opportunities for this. But in certain situations you don't. You're really just looking at yes or no. Can you go through with the purchase? One other thing I need to mention: any contract any offer you make should have an inspection period. Usually on a house, on a single family, the closing is 30 days. Some will want you to close sooner. A lot of wholesalers, if you buy from them, will close in 10, 15 days. But the general rule of thumb is that it's 30 days. And generally, the inspection period is 10 to 15. In that period of time, you can back out of the deal and get your earnest money back. So you can, and that's important. You want to get your inspections done and realize whether or not you want to buy the property or whether you don't want to buy the property, and then get your earnest money back. You can also put in a financing contingency, which just says, this purchase is contingent upon being able to finance the property, getting a loan for the property. Some sellers will cross that off and be like, no, you can't have that. But especially banks, they almost always want you to either buy for cash or go, like a Fannie Mae is not going to let you do that. But if you have that financing contingency and then your loan falls out, the bank won't lend to you, then you can get your earnest money back, assuming the seller is willing to accept it. I'll go through a couple more questions before we get back to that. Thomas, I've heard it's good to walk through a property in bad weather. Would you recommend that too? I would say, well, I would say not really bad weather. If you can't, if it's so bad that you can't see the property very well, you have a hard time seeing it all. That's not a good thing. But one of the things I would say, we have one apartment that we were refinancing, and it just looked so much worse after it rained because the rain would just kind of puddle in certain areas. It wasn't flooding anything, but it just looked so damp and gross. It might be better to go after a rain if you can set it up easily. And then you kind of see what it looks like, or if it's drizzling or whatnot. But you want to check that. You want to look at the roof too. And if it's raining down, you generally have what I would expect to look at the roof. But it's just pouring rain, you're probably not going to want to do that. So I'd say if it's I would not go out of my way to do this, but if it's easy to do it like after rain or when it's drizzling and kind of see the property in its worst condition, or see if water is coming into the basement or whatnot, yeah, that's a better thing to do. But at the same time, you might not be able to find a good day to do that. And I certainly wouldn't wait a week or more than that for that. If you can do it Wednesday instead of Tuesday, or maybe Friday instead of Tuesday or something, some of it may be okay. But I wouldn't wait too long to do that. From Cody, this is from Cody, how do you get into a turnkey buy and hold rentals for low money down? With turnkey buy and hold for low money down, I think that would probably be, that's just how much, with turnkey, unless they're willing to finance it themselves for low money down, you're looking at, you're going to need to find some sort of private financing, maybe private money lenders. But generally with turnkey, you're going to be buying relatively close to market. And so it's dangerous to finance it that high. There are exceptions, but generally it's going to be pretty close to market, sometimes over. And there are many good turnkey companies, but there are also some really bad ones, and that will charge way over. And I'd be very careful about financing something up to close to what you're purchasing it for, unless you're getting a really good deal. Let's see. So do we got any more due diligence related questions? So, okay. So, okay, I think let's keep going with the due diligence here. And I'll get back to some of these other related questions here in a little bit. Maybe go on a tangent. But one thing I would say, that one of some of the key items to look for when you're going through a due diligence, you want to look for old HVAC. And one of the big keys about this is you got to remember that a house, HVAC or any key item, they're capital items. They're depreciated over certain amounts of time because they aren't worth as much old as they are new. And so like a furnace, I think depreciates over 15 years or 10 years, something. I can't remember exactly, but you have a furnace that looks like, okay, it still works. You got the utilities on, it's still heating, but it's like one of those green furnaces, or it's old. You can usually check the dates, or I wish I had some time. There's a website you can actually take a picture of the serial, the tag on it, and figure out what the date was. We can usually get a general idea whether it's new or old. And if it's old, you got to assume that this is going to be a cost. I might not have to incur it now, but I'll have to incur it later. And also, if I'm looking to flip the property, that's something that sellers are going to look at. If you have a fuse box, you probably want to replace that with an electrical panel, which is going to cost you probably at least $1,000. If you have a Federal Pacific panel, which you can Google what those look like, it will say Federal Pacific. They weren't technically recalled, but they were effectively recalled. They're basically useless. Pushmatic panels, where they look like buttons going down the middle. Those are also not very good. I wouldn't say you have to replace them, but you should see that they are certainly less valuable than a regular electrical panel, and you might want to. Ungrounded electrical, you especially see this in a lot of old houses. I'd probably say half the houses in Kansas City have ungrounded, and it's not easily fixable. It's something that you kind of have to live with in certain cases. But you can figure this out with a simple tester. You just put it in, and it usually will tell you both one if it has power, and two if it's grounded or not. You want to look for any plumbing leaks. It's important to get the water on. It's very obvious if you see there's a leak, and you can also just look at the dial in the main, and if it's spinning, that means there's a leak, even if you can't find it. Galvanized plumbing is something to look for. Copper is good. PEX is better. That's the red and blue plumbing. Galvanized plumbing just looks like metal. I mean, it's like metal plumbing, and the problem is it generally rusts, and if it's in an older home, it probably has rusted, and you probably don't have very good water pressure. You can check to see if you have water pressure. But if you have very poor water pressure and galvanized plumbing and it's rusted, probably means you need to replace at least a good deal of your plumbing. And so that's something to be careful of. Appliances, I mean, obviously it's pretty clear. If you got anything that's brown, that's almost certainly old. Dry rot and pests. I mean, you want to learn what mud tunnels look like for termites. You'll especially see this along drywall and whatnot. Or if you have any earth with, I don't know why they call it earth ground contact. It should be house ground contact on the exterior of the house. If the siding runs along the dirt, almost certainly you've probably gotten pests. You want about, I think it's supposed to be at least 4 inches. The siding should be 4 inches off the ground. If it's not, if it's really close, or if it's touching, you've probably got a pest issue. In the bathroom, particularly for dry rot, you step around the toilet and step around the tub, see if it's soggy. Look for wood that deteriorates easily. These are things that, these are important things. They can oftentimes when you open up a wall that has dry rot, it's a lot worse than you thought it was originally. So these are major things that you want to know about beforehand before you purchase the property. If you didn't know about them beforehand, you want to ask, or you didn't know about them when you got under contract, and you find out about them, you want to ask for a discount. Roof leaks, look at the ceilings and see if you have any wet spots. In addition to that, you want to get on the roof, and you can look on the roof and you can see if you see large little they look like it's been impacted or something like that. There's a spot like that's probably hail damage. If the shingles are starting to kind of lip up a bit, that's a sign that it's very old. You look at the side and see how many layers are at. If it's more than one, that's not a good thing. And you really should have unless you're familiar with roofs, you should have an inspector take a look at that, or a contractor take a look at that, because roofs are a big ticket item. They're generally $5,000 and up, and oftentimes if you have a lot of damage, you'll have damage to the decking underneath the roof, and that's just more expense right there. You also want to look for water in the basement. This is especially true if they finish the basement, or if they have if you go into a finished basement, but there's drywall except for the bottom 2 feet, that almost certainly means they were getting mold in the house, because there's water in the basement, and that area is really not usable space unless you're able to stop that water from coming in. And I will say, stopping water from getting into a basement can be extremely tricky. You cannot really seal it. If it's just seeping in from underneath the sides, you can't really seal it from the inside. You really have to dig down on the outside of the house to seal it, which is extremely expensive. Now, of course, if you have cracks, you can seal that with epoxy, but that's not a cheap process, and so you need to check that out. And you also want to see if the wall is coming in. If the wall goes in, I think it's over 3 inches, or it's 4 inches. 4 inches it's not financeable by FHA. And you can kind of see this from the inside, but really the easiest way is to just go along the outside, put your finger up against the siding, and see it should go to about to your knuckle. If it starts going deeper, you almost have to put your hand in to reach it. You can see that wall is coming down a lot. If it's gone down, a good, I'm not sure the exact cutoff. But if it's substantial leaning, you might have to push that wall back, which is, you're probably looking at 10,000 plus. If not, you can put up braces, which usually cost about $500 a piece, and that helps secure the wall. But these are all expenses, and an inspector and a contractor can help walk you through this. I know there's a lot here to chew on, but these are all things you want to keep in mind when you're looking at this house, and especially early on, getting another investor, a mentor, a contractor, an inspector to help you take all this into account is very important. But having an idea of what you're looking for just by this kind of thing is critical. And you want to take a look at all this and verify all of your assumptions. You go through and verify that the expenses that you thought you were going to be paying on the rehab of this property are accurate. And that's pretty much what when I see due diligence on our side, I've got my pre-contract estimate, and I'm going in to verify that. And I don't want to go in. I'm not trying to, I almost kind of almost your devil's advocate, making sure you're not missing something. And if it's a little off, maybe that's not a big deal. But if you're substantially off, or you miss something entirely, or there's something they misrepresented or didn't tell you, then yeah, then it's time to start asking for a discount or considering backing out of the property if you can't get that. Yeah, fighter. Extra steps to take in a flood zone. This is flood zones are pretty much just kind of, they are what they are. We have a property in that flood zone that actually is a 100-year flood zone, and it flooded twice last year. So I expect no floods for 199 years. The thing about it though is flood insurance is regulated by the federal government, by FEMA. If you're in a floodplain, you're in a floodplain. And the main thing to know is you're going to have to pay flood insurance, and it's pretty much the same with any insurance company because it's kind of federally set. And so now you will be insured. That being said, if you have losses, you have a deductible, so you're not necessarily going to come out completely whole. But at the same time, the main thing to consider is, let's say you're flipping the property. Does the fact that it's in a flood zone reduce the value of this property so much so that I can no longer hit my profit target? So it's good. You want to find another comparable that's in a flood zone. Like, how is it affected? If you're renting out the property, now you got to pay flood insurance on top of your regular property insurance, on top of your taxes and all the rest of the things. Does that flood insurance kill the deal? That's what you're really looking. That's the main thing about a flood zone. You're just adding an expense. It's kind of like when you buy a condo. Okay, you're adding the expense of an HOA. Does that HOA make it so this property cannot cash flow? Most of the time, I would say the answer is yes. I mean, most condos I've had to just not even look at because its HOA kills it. There are exceptions, especially if the HOA is a bit cheaper. We just bought a very weird package of 17 condos in a complex of 35 that had a pretty cheap HOA. They rent out for about $1,000 to $1,100, and the HOA is only $200. And you do save a little bit. I mean, they take care of trash and the exterior maintenance and whatnot. So it's just another expense you need to look at and add to your when you're doing your financial due diligence. So let's see, any other questions to check out? Let's see. Felipe has a question about tax sales. Got some issues with one property. Well, with tax sales, I would definitely recommend. One of the biggest problems with tax sales is getting clear title. Even in a foreclosure title, not all liens are taken off. Federal tax liens are not taken off of properties in foreclosure auctions. In tax auctions, from my understanding, they just quit claim the deed to you. So it's very tricky to get all the liens off. You want to talk to a title company, probably an attorney, before you jump into that. The biggest issue, the due diligence there, is title. Usually title is not a major issue for me because whenever you're buying a property from another seller, you send it to a title company, or in certain states an attorney. They offer you title insurance, or you pay for it, and then they make sure there's clear title. If there's not, if they weren't able to cash something, you can get that reimbursed because they've offered you title insurance, and their errors and omissions insurance will cover that. Now with foreclosure auctions, for the most part, that's good, except for some liens carry along with it, like federal tax liens. With tax auctions, from my understanding, we haven't jumped into that. Pretty much nothing gets wiped off, so you need to be very, very careful. And I would talk to an attorney before jumping into that kind of thing. So I would say let's jump into with regards to houses. Let's finish this part up before we go to apartments. Of course, sometimes you're getting a house that already has a tenant in there. And there's sort of this temptation, I think, when you already have a tenant, to kind of see it as not something you need to put rehab into. You're just inheriting this tenant, but you still need to do this. You might not have to pay that rehab immediately. You're going to need to check later. And when you do have a tenant, you want to make sure you have, get a copy of the lease, make sure get a copy of the rent roll, make sure that they're paying. You want to check on all of those things. I will say there's something called an estoppel certificate. I think it's ESTOPPEL. And I've heard of people getting these with apartments. We generally have not. Basically what it is you give them to the tenants, and the tenant fills them out telling you what they're paying in rent and all the rest of it. If you're buying a huge apartment complex, it's going to be very, very tough to get all the tenants to do that. You should be able to get the financials and leases and enough to prove that. And if they're providing you false leases, you have obviously the opportunity to sue. If you're buying a commercial property, though, like let's say a 4-unit commercial property where each person pays like $3,000, $4,000 in rent or more, yeah, I would absolutely recommend getting a estoppel certificates, making sure we go to the tenants and that we know that the tenants are paying what you think they're paying. Because in that case, with commercial properties, industrial properties, retail properties, your tenants are such a bigger percentage of what you have. There's so much more important. Like in commercial, if you have a tenant, you are just killing it. If you don't have a tenant, you're in bad shape because it can be, especially in depressed markets, it can be very tough to get a tenant. Usually in apartments, houses, even in not that great of markets, you can still find a tenant. With commercial, it ain't that easy. Commercial properties can be vacant for a long time. And so you definitely need to do a lot more attention and verify it. So I'd highly recommend, if you are getting into commercial, retail, or industrial, definitely go for estoppel certificates. With apartments, if you're going to buy apartments, you definitely want you need to do a lot more with regards to the financial due diligence as well. You're not just looking at the condition of the property. Now, if you have a tenant in a house, we certainly want to look at their lease, their rent roll, make sure they're paying the rent, etc. But an operating statement doesn't help you that much because if they have one bad turnover, that's a huge spike. It's hard to get good data from one data point. If you have 100 data points, that's okay. That's good data, but one data point can have aberrations. They could have outliers. So it's much more important with apartments. You want a rent roll. You want and you want to check what their what percent occupancy they are. You want to check what percent economic occupancy they are. They're not necessarily the same thing. A lot of times these apartments will have 92% occupancy, but only 75% of the tenants are paying, or they got 8 tenants under eviction or something like that. Or if it's small, fourplex, they got all 4 leased, but one's not paying, one's already being evicted. That property is less than 50% occupied because I'd rather have a tenant I'd rather be vacant than have a tenant who wasn't paying and to be evicted. Eviction costs money. It's time where you can't lease the property. It's just a dead sunk cost. So you want to look at that very carefully. Preferably ask for an aged receivables report. That gives you aged receivables shows how much of their debt is past due by 1 to 30 days, 31 to 60 days, 61 to 90 days, and so that kind of thing is very it can give you a good idea of how much are these tenants actually even paying? Because if you have a lot of you want to think about your property in a certain way. Are you buying an apartment? Could be this could be from duplex and maybe more like a fourplex up. But are you buying this property for it to are you just planning on stepping into a working asset that's going to provide immediate cash flow, or is this a reposition, or is it a minor reposition? Like you need to reposition, like a reposition. Basically, we are going to change this entire or virtually all the tenant base. We're upgrading a C property to maybe a B property. Might be a bit of a push, but maybe a B minus or something like that. A minor reposition would be like, okay, we've got some issues. We got too much vacancy. We need to make some improvements. We need to get a couple tenants out. Maybe we're turning over 30% of it or something like that. 30% of your tenant base. So it's kind of the difference between those two. But you need to know what you're looking at. And so if you have high occupancy but really high economic occupancy, a lot of people aren't paying. That should be a big sign. This is a big indicator there's a major problem, and you're probably looking at least at a minor reposition. You also want to look at the operating statement. You want to go back in history, and there's some key things to look at in this operating statement. One is there are several things you need to look at. One, we're going to get into a little accounting here, so I'm sorry. Right off the bat, I'll just apologize. You want to know whether you're looking at a cash statement or an accrual statement. A cash statement means everything is being expensed in that month. So if I prepay my insurance in March for the next 6 months for $10,000, let's say it's one property, so I pay $500 for the next 6 months. That all goes in March. If it's accrual, then it gets split up. it doesn't go until the month that it's actually incurred. Now, the thing about accrual, though, accrual is actually better overall. It's better to know when things are being spent, but they might not. They might have these bad debts they haven't expensed off. Like, because if you with accrual with the income, when it assumes that all of your rent was paid, and then you write off the bad debts. And so you need to make sure if it's accrual that all the bad debts have been written off. The other thing is misallocated capital expenses. Now, capital expenses, the difference between operating expenses and capital expenses, operating expenses are things that are generally stuff that is incurred yearly, and so like if you got a maintenance thing, that's a yearly expense. Insurance is a yearly thing, taxes are yearly. Your trash contract, your utilities are yearly. There's just things that are your revenue wise. The rent income is yearly. Capital expenses are expenses that are longer term. So like if you replace your HVAC, that should last 25, 30 years. That's a capital expense. But I see it all the time. But there's a lot of gray area here because you have reoccurring capital expenses. And so like, is replacing carpet a capital expense? Like on a turnover? To me, it's not. I guess it would last longer than a year, but I see it as just a general maintenance / turnover expense. But a lot of apartments capitalize it. And also, you need to know that there is a recurring capital expense. I have a line item with apartments. There are 10 fixed costs, there's 10 total cost items. 4 of them are generally kind of fixed, and that would be your taxes, your insurance, your utilities, more or less, and your management fee, your property management fee. And even if you're managing yourself, you should see this as a fee because you got to pay yourself for your own work. Your time is not free. And then you have 6 variable expenses that kind of depend on how well you're doing, all sorts of stuff like that. That would include your maintenance and repair costs, your contract expenses, like if you have like satellite or trash or something like that. You have your administrative fees, which would be stuff like if you have an office on site at the apartment complex, your phone costs, internet costs, cost of printing out, your post-its on sites or mailings or whatever. You have marketing expenses, if you're paying any money for newspaper ads, if anybody still does that. I'm sure somebody still advertises their houses or apartments in newspapers. You have your payroll, if you have on-staff payroll. Now if you don't have, for most of you just have a house to rent, it's just your management fee. You don't have a payroll. But if you have an apartment complex, a larger apartment complex, with a staff that works at that apartment complex, then you have a payroll too. And the final one is recurring capital expenses. And that's expenses that, I know that, let's say we have a 10 unit, let's say we have a 30 unit, apartment complex. I know that 1 or 2 of my HVACs is going to go out every year. That's a recurring, I don't know when, each one will last an average of 25, 30 years, but I know one's going to go out every year, approximately, maybe 2. So that's a recurring capital expense. I want to see this and think of it as an operating expense. Even though technically it's a capital expense. If that makes sense. I can go over this a little bit more detail. Anyone in the comments just want to let me know if that doesn't make a lot of sense. But you really need to look carefully at whether or not they are capitalizing stuff that shouldn't be capitalized. And you also need to account for the fact that it might not be underhanded, but you need to account for the fact that you will have capital expenses or recurring capital expenses. Like this needs to be kind of thought as like, I need to be able to pay for these recurring capital expenses out of my cash flow or the property isn't working. So you need to look at that. And a lot of times people try to hide stuff in the capital expenses that shouldn't be there. And you need to find it. It's a really critical thing. With apartments, this is something you want to do up front. You want to definitely check it on once you've got it under contract. But this is stuff you want to do up front. One thing I would say, you always want to put together your own pro forma. Like how well you think this property will do, what kind of cap rate you think it's going to get. Don't trust theirs. I call them, they're pro ficas. I've never seen a seller really, they've been more or less honest, but they're always going to be, their pro formas, which is just kind of their estimates of how a property will do, what kind of income it will have, what kind of expenses it will have. They're always shockingly favorable to the seller, so be very careful with those. So here we go. Let's see, any questions here? So Tom, So here's from Thomas. When you have a vacancy, to use that time to do upgrades on the empty unit? And my answer is just yes. Like if we have a property that we bought that had an inherited tenant, once we finally get that vacant, we, if the tenant's a problem, if they're behavioral problems or not paying, okay, we'll evict them. If we are way ahead of things, we might raise their rent, and then they generally will probably move out. If not, we will just kind of wait and maybe give them a decent rent raise if we have other projects we have backlog. But yeah, once they leave, that's the time to fix it up. That's the time to get it up to your standards. And so you've got to assume, going in beforehand, it might be. I mean, we've had properties that we bought, 2 year and held for 2 years with an old tenant, maybe is under market rate, but also we didn't have to pay the rehab, and we're not in a rush. We got other stuff. We've generally had more work than labor, so we've always been kind of a little bit behind the 8 ball in getting a rehab and turnover done. We're not in a hurry to get to it, and they finally move out. We do the rehab then, but you got to know, it's still part of that acquisition cost. And by the way, we capitalize that if you're thinking accounting. It's not an operating. If you're doing a rehab 2 years later, it's still a capital expense. Let's see, any more questions related to this? Okay, I think we're good here. Let me go a little bit into, we got about 15 minutes. Once we get through that, I can answer a few of any other questions. So if you have an apartment, I recommend walking every unit. Don't settle for just walking every other, every third. I mean, when you're looking at a property originally up front before having their contract, yeah, you can walk, just a couple, maybe whatever they have available, whatever. You're just trying to get a good feel for it. And remember, you're saying like, these are my assumptions going in. These are my assumptions I have. You're looking at approximately this cost in rehab. Most of the units are in this kind of shape, and I usually tell them that. But you want to verify that, and I walk everything. I ask them to walk, even if it's 100, even if it's 200. I had friends that got 4 apartment complexes with almost 500 units under contract, and they walked every single unit. And that one actually fell apart, so that I felt very bad for them. As far as inspectors go, it'd be very expensive to have an inspector look at every single unit. But so generally, what I would do is I walk it first, and if particular items I want to look at, I'll ask to have a second walkthrough with the inspector and just look at those particular items. I will almost always look at the roofs. Those are really expensive on apartments. And if I want to check are these panels good, or we have an electrical issue or plumbing issue or something like that, I'll have an inspector come and take a look at that. If it's a bigger property, probably above 50 units, maybe you're probably going to have a phase 1, which is an environmental study. You don't want to buy a property that has a sewage dump on it. Occasionally, if this is really with really big properties, it might make you get a phase 2, but I don't think anyone in this live stream needs to worry about that. Some will ask for a survey. That's really only banks occasionally ask for that. I very rarely say they probably need to worry about that. But again, you do want to get all the leases, and I would get the leases and get an Excel document and kind of what are the terms of these leases? Are they month to month? Are they yearly? When's their late fee due? Do they allow pets? Do they kind of all sorts of stuff like that? And also, when you're walking through these units, you want to ask the tenants. I mean, usually they're not. Usually the seller will not want you to say something like the property's under sale. They'll often say pretend to be an insurance inspector, but you can still ask the tenants some basic questions. How do you like living here? Have you had any problems or whatnot? And you get some good feedback there. And you also. I'd ask around the neighborhood, go look at a lot of this you should be doing beforehand, but you double check it afterwards. Check the website. How much crime have you had? You can even call a police department with regards to an apartment complex. How many police calls have you had out there? They'll usually give you a list. At least they do in Kansas City. Go by at night. Go by the property at night and see if it's just a mess, if it's parties everywhere, people shooting guns in the air or whatever, or see if it's nice and quiet and kind of a family attitude and whatnot. And so, these are all things you want to take a look at and be very careful. And every assumption that you have going in, everything you've looked at, everything you've written, you want to verify that. You want every point you have, and you want to think about it a little bit in terms of devil's advocate, especially if it's a bigger property. You do not want to be buying a really large apartment complex or office building or whatever, unless you've really challenged, not just verified your assumptions, but challenged your assumptions. Like, what am I missing? And really push hard on that angle. And also, you know, it might not be something where you're looking to back out, but you might find an angle that can make sense to retrade on something and get a discount. Now, I would say with retrading, it's not good to get in a habit of it, especially if you're buying a large number of portfolios or apartments. You don't want to become known as a retrader. That's not a good reputation to have. But you do want to retrade if it makes sense to retrade. So that's just a good little tip there. Okay, let's go through some questions. I will open it up. Then we have a couple questions that are not quite related to due diligence. I will open it up for those as well. Let's see. Brian notes that assessment of the property before the offer is key to buying. Absolutely agree with that. So Gamma Fighter asks, what are some things you ask the seller before you even look at the property? Some of the things I would ask, let's go back to houses. So some of the things I would ask the houses is, first of all, I just ask them, you know, what is the condition of it? Start with open-ended questions. Like, oftentimes you haven't even thought of what the big problem might be. So just start with open-ended. What's the condition of it? Then ask kind of, what's the biggest problem you've had with it? They kind of force them to give you at least some sort of answer. You can ask what the age of the furnace is. You can ask what, you know, have you had any leaks? Have you had any sewer backups? Have you had any electrical issues? How old is the roof? These are good questions to ask. Oftentimes you get pictures of it. You want to be able to, you know, kind of vet properties pretty quickly over the phone, or you know, if you're getting them sent to you by email by wholesalers or whatever. You don't want to waste your time going to look at it a bunch. So you want to be able to say no very quickly. This is an important skill to learn. I mean, early on, you're probably going to want to look at everything. And that's fine. It's good learning actually, but you do want to learn to vet these things very quickly. So those are some good questions. Start with open-ended questions, then get kind of down that list. Asking about the big ticket items, the roof, the furnace, the AC, or whether it even has AC. A lot of houses don't. Do you have any foundation cracks? Has the foundation moved at all? And things like that. And then if they have pictures and they can just send them to you easily, that would be nice. And usually you can start to get a point where if they give you the broad pictures, where you can kind of get, you know, I've gotten to the point where I can guesstimate in a decent range what a house's repairs will be just by looking at pictures if I get 10 or so of them. So you start to learn, you start to develop these skills as you gain more experience. But that's the first place to start, is broad questions and then narrow down to the big ticket items. When you're looking at condition, that's only regarding condition. There's other things with regards to, like, what's their motivation level, what are they willing to sell for, are they willing to sell or financing, etc. Donald asks, what kind of reports would you recommend running for screening tenants, and how do you go about running them? I mean, you just want to find a good. You want to look at their credit, their background history, whether or not they have any criminal, and their eviction record, as well as checking references on their previous landlords and employment. And there's a lot of companies out there that do these sorts of background checks. Not very many that do checks on landlords and employment as well, but you can do those yourself. If you can find a company to do it, I recommend it. But you just want to make sure that they have a job that pays 3 times the rent and income, generally speaking. If you're in a more expensive market, maybe not quite that much. And also that they have at least, you know, a year of solid rental history. And then you want to make sure they don't have any felonies and evictions and whatnot. From Thomas, can you trust the owners to be honest with you about the home's problems? No. Amon just bought 3 duplexes. I will amend that with Thomas's question. You can, it's kind of one of those things. If they say yes, it's probably a problem. I've rarely heard a homeowner, say they had a problem that didn't exist. If they say no or they don't know, that's not for sure. It's one of those things. Be kind. Don't accuse anybody of lying to you or anything like that. Usually they're not. Oftentimes they just don't know. But verify everything. Let's see. Amon, this is from Amon. Just bought 3 duplexes. Previous owner is paying for lawn care and trash and sewer. However, the lease has mentioned that tenants are responsible for it. What do I do for these existing tenants? Well, I mean, there's a couple things you can do. You can just tell them that they're responsible and that they need to start paying. I mean, they should be paying. You could also, if you feel like that's a little too confrontational, you could wait until their sort of the lease renewals are up, or do it one at a time. But I mean, if they're supposed to be paying, they're supposed to be paying. And I don't know if they're under a full year lease. This might make it a little bit trickier. But if it's in the lease that they're supposed to be paying, you have the legal right to make them pay. So it might be a bit uncomfortable, that a little bit of conflict. But yeah, I mean, it's if they're under a lease contract, they're contractually obligated, as the lease states, to pay those utilities. They're just kind of, I mean, that's just how it is. And so you can say, well, we got to follow the lease. This is what it was. What the previous owner is doing doesn't matter. Let's see here. Let's see if I'm missing any questions here. Okay, this is from Michael. Would you call every tenant and confirm their rent before buying? I mean, that's pretty much the same as getting an estoppel certificate. Although an estoppel certificate is a little bit more of, calling them is just verifying it. I generally don't. I'm comfortable enough with the rent roll and the lease. If I need the lease, I know some who would demand like bank statements proving that that the seller is getting the income and whatnot, or deposit slips. We've actually requested deposit slips before for rent on apartments, especially if they don't have good documentation elsewhere. So especially proof of deposit is not a bad thing. That's not a bad thing to do. But personally calling the tenants, usually they're not going to let me, even if it's gone past its due date, the inspection period. I'm sorry, the due date of the inspection period. But yeah, I'd say only with bigger complexes am I really going there, and I'd go with the estoppel certificates, making sure that the tenant is paying exactly what the landlord says they are. But usually, if I have the lease and I have the rent roll, and often have proof of deposit, like deposit slips and whatnot, that's comfortable enough for me on houses and apartments. When if it's a house, I usually want to release it in one way or another. It's usually very rarely buy houses where they're rented at what we would consider market, because they're not to our quality. So it's like, even if they're rented, we still want to fix it up and rent it out. So I'm not really that concerned about losing the tenant. With apartments, I'd certainly be worried about losing 30, 40, 50 tenants, or having them paying less. But no, I don't feel like I need to individually call them. One other thing I should note with regards to apartments, I went over the house contracts, but I didn't mention apartment contracts. Again, contracts are negotiable. Everything is up for negotiation, so there's no firm rule. But generally speaking, with apartments with larger, not a duplex, but with like a 20, 30 unit apartment, you're looking at a 60-day close, 30 days of inspection periods, and that's when you do your walkthroughs. You get your inspectors out there, do your phase one, look over all the leases, maybe your estoppel certificates, get proof deposits, so get copies of their contracts. You want copies of their contracts for trash, copies of their contracts for, if they have satellite, copies of their contracts for laundry. Laundry contracts are the most vicious contracts I've ever seen. They're like 15 years, and you automatically renew and charge. They're brutal. So you want to know if there's a laundry contract, any contract they have on the property. If anything like that, you want to get any sort of contracts and stuff like that. Maybe you want to look at particular bills. Maybe the utilities don't look right. You want to look at previous utility bills for the last 2 months. That's a good idea. Different expenses like that. So there's a lot of stuff to look for. If they really wanted to hide something from you, they probably could. You can't, if there's an expense somewhere out there and they never put it at the property and burnt the invoice, there's just no real way to find it. Most aren't going to do stuff like that, and you're going to be able to find most of it. But that kind of goes into a general way of thinking. Assume it will be worse than it looks. Like, if you are just barely making do, like, okay, like this, if everything goes right on this property, it'll be perfect. Probably everything's going to go wrong. Like, you can never, you should always have a comfort zone. Like, you should always, like, this property I believe it will work, but even if it doesn't work up to my expectations, it will still, get by. That should be a general way of thinking. You never want to go and think, it has to work as I anticipate exactly, or I'm screwed. That's a horrible way to think, because I mean, you're eventually going to lose. Like a gambler always eventually loses to the house, and that's how it's going to be if you approach it that way. But I think I got off topic there. But with an apartment contract, it's usually, or office, it's usually 30 days of due diligence, inspection period, and then 30 days to close. We often put in our contracts an additional addendum that say we can put additional earnest money down to get another 30 days if it's for reasons like a loan document is taking too long or something like that. That just gives us a little bit of leeway in case it's taking longer to close. I have heard of cases where a buyer wanted to close, but just couldn't get it together, and then the seller backed out. Especially if they get a better price, get a backup offer, they might just yank it from you. Want any excuse they can to yank it from you. So it's very important to put that kind of stuff in the contract. We actually at one time used that. We used that one time when we had a bank back out on us on a 32-unit apartment purchase 7 days before it was supposed to close, which was just wonderful. But we were able to find another bank, and since we had that clause, we were able to extend the closing. Let's see, we got any other questions here? We got 3 different windows open, one with the BiggerPockets, one with the Facebook, and one with YouTube, going all of the questions. We just hit 1 hour, so I think we're probably good here. Next week I think I'm probably not going to be available. Actually, we have one more question from JR. If an apartment is under contract, does that mean you made an offer and will be changing it, or is it just saying you're a serious buyer? No, if it's under contract, that means buyer and seller have agreed and it's signed, and it's the earnest money and the contractor with the title company or with an attorney, depending which state you're in. And at this point, you can only back out based on the terms of that contract, and the seller can only back out based on the terms of that contract. So no, if you're under contract, that means you are. It's not a matter of you're being serious or there's other offers. No, you are under contract. It is. You've entered that stage where now the buyer and seller are contractually obligated to each other based on the terms of that contract. The property isn't closed, but you're obligated to each other. Let's see. I think that's going to wrap it up here. We've just crossed the hour mark. I will post a couple of articles on due diligence in the comments after this if you're interested in more on this subject. Again, I don't think I'm going to be back next week, but the week after that, my brother Philip will be joining me again, and we will be discussing property management one more time. This time, the dreaded question of whether or not to manage yourself or hire a property manager, and what to ask yourself and think about in those when going about there. What are the advantages and disadvantages, and just kind of whichever way you go, how to go about doing that. So, thank you very much for joining me. Have a great weekend, and I look forward to seeing you guys soon.